Hey, y'all, it's Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Good to have you with us. I think this is actually going to be a pretty fascinating version of our program today because we're actually going to follow up with some quotes from Kirby Smart on the subject we dealt with. I can't remember if it was last week or how many days ago it's been, on this idea of scheduling and maybe Georgia and Auburn actually somewhat aligned here in terms of something that they'd like to see get done. And I love the way that Kirby Smart emphatically says it needs to happen. That's all on the way. Mike Johnson here as well. We're glad you're with us. DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, begins right now.
From DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So I brought this up on the show a few days ago. I was telling the video audience a moment ago, I can't remember how long ago it was, but the notion that maybe Georgia and Auburn are actually somewhat aligned in their agreement here, that there ought to be some sort of flip in the schedule for the rivalry so that Auburn doesn't have to go to Georgia and Alabama in the same year, and Georgia could kind of balance some of its rivalry games out a bit. You know, you've got right now in a year like 2018, Auburn, Tennessee, and Georgia Tech, three traditional rivals of the Dogs, kind of all coming into Athens for the same year. I said the other day that, hey, maybe this just needs to be flip-flopped, and maybe Auburn and Georgia can both agree with this. But the funny thing is, the response from a lot of Georgia fans at the time was, if Gus Malzahn wants it, we don't want it, even if it's ultimately good news for UGA. It's the kind of thing where rivalry may supersede common sense a bit. And, listen, I'm right there with you. I kind of understand where that comes from, even if it's a good idea. If it's a good idea that Malzahn agrees with, and how good of an idea could it truly be? There's more on this today. It involves Kirby Smart. I'll get to that in a moment. But let me go back in time to what sort of started this entire conversation about scheduling and how Georgia's rivalry games should be set up, how Auburn's rivalry games should be set up, how the home and away balance should be defined when it comes to these SEC teams. Gus Malzahn, in audio that we played for you here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza a few days ago, goes on the very good sports radio station in Birmingham, WJOX. The question comes up about scheduling and, kind of what you deal with in a year like this, in which Auburn has to travel to Georgia and Alabama in the month of November. Of course, a little bit of a ding on Malzahn's program is how they performed outside of Jordan-Hare stadiums. That's obviously a hot-button topic there on the Plains. And Malzahn made a suggestion at the time that I thought maybe even some Georgia fans, or maybe even most Georgia fans, could agree with. Here's a reminder from Malzahn to set us up for where we're going today.
I think the big thing is having them staggered, one at home and one away.
Yeah.
Would probably be the best for those two at the end. Last year was two at home, this year it's two away. And look back in 2010, we played Georgia at home, we played Alabama away, and that would be my wish.
So that's Gus Malzahn saying that's his wish. And as I said, the way that I presented this on our program was, and you know what? This may be an idea that Gus Malzahn has that Georgia fans might actually be able to agree with. And I heard from so many of you, whether it be the live video commenters or the people who posted a comment to the podcast when it was posted. Listen, if Gus Malzahn wants it, I'm not helping him with nothing. He can fend for himself here, be that as it may. It does sound like Kirby Smart would like this, and it sounds like Kirby Smart has a memory of kind of how this schedule for Georgia and maybe the schedule for Auburn got out of whack. Go back to 2012 and 2013. Georgia travels to Auburn 2 years in a row to accommodate the addition of two more teams in the SEC. This is back when Missouri and Texas A&M first joined the league. That was a favor that Georgia did for the SEC, and in a roundabout way, it turned out to be a bit of a favor for Auburn, too. And Kirby Smart would like a little bit of payback for that, and I love the way that he said this yesterday at the SEC spring meetings there in Destin, Florida. Here's a little bit of Kirby Smart.
Yeah, absolutely. We get a chance to fix that and return the favor that we paid to them. I hear about that a lot. Obviously, I wasn't there, but about the 2 times they had to travel back to back, I think we can make it more consistent and we balance things out. Probably be helpful in the long run, but I got a feeling there's more to it than just us and them. It always affects so many other moving parts, but it would be nice to do that.
Our buddy Mike Griffith is the one who recorded that for us, and he recorded for video, so maybe the audio quality is not as perfect as some of the other clips we play, but there's one particular part of that clip that I really like. When Kirby Smart says there they need to return the favor that we paid for them way back in 2012 and 2013, Mike's got his camera apparatus sitting back there with all the riders, and you hear all that rat-a-tat tapping of keyboards. The moment Kirby Smart says this is all the sports writers in the room, and they know they've got themselves a good quote when Kirby Smart says that. That's why you hear that, rat-a-tat-tat of that keyboard start, working right there, because that's obviously a pretty bold statement there from Kirby Smart. It's the kind of thing that's going to get some attention that, hey, the SEC did a favor for Auburn, did a favor for the SEC years ago, and now we need a sort of return on that favor. And this is, to me, another example of why Georgia fans like Kirby Smart so much, because it was a favor. And, I think there are a lot of Georgia fans who sort of view an era pre-Kirby Smart where it seemed like Georgia was always doing favors for the rest of the SEC, always sort of, sacrificing its own best interest in exchange for what sort of benefited others collectively. And, you've heard the phrase before, maybe no good deed goes unpunished. This may be an example of that where Georgia did a favor and got nothing in return. And here we are moving into the 2018 season, sort of still waiting for some sort of, favor to be returned, some sort of benefit for the sort of selfless act of having to go to Jordan-Hare Stadium, 2 seasons in a row here. And I think that Kirby Smart is sort of speaking the language of Georgia fans when he says, hey, what's in it for me here? There's nothing wrong with being nice and doing something for somebody else, but in the sort of cutthroat competition that is SEC football, being too selfless is a good way to get buried at the bottom of the league here. And I think a lot of Georgia fans like what Kirby Smart has to say about that in that regard. Here's a little more from Kirby, by the way, sort of talking about the challenge of maybe rebalancing the schedule so that, it does benefit Auburn. They're not having to go, to their 2 big rivals on the road in the same year, the way they will in 2018. And also for Georgia, you can just kind of spread out some of these home games so that you're not playing a lot of your key rivals at home in one year and then sort of left without one of those kind of games the following year. Here's a little more from Kirby Smart.
Yeah, I feel like if we fix it from that perspective, it would help, and it would help with not having 2 road games back-to-back for us in the situation we had like this year with the Auburn and the Georgia Tech back-to-back. But it's not exactly way high on the priority list. I understand there's problems and difficulties trying to appease everybody, especially with the SEC conference having to do it. And the way I understand it, the reason it happened the first time was because of the addition of the 2 teams.
So Kirby Smart says, listen, I know there are problems and difficulties. These are, they're a little bit like battleships. They turn slowly, and, there's a lot of different factions that have to be appeased here. But, there is something to be said for being the sort of squeaky wheel here by, putting your fist down on the table and say, hey, we really want this. Make this right for us. And, this sort of brings up some of the things that people at times, I think, don't like about Georgia Athletic Director Greg McGarity. Now, if McGarity were sitting here and in this room right now having this conversation with us, the one thing that he would say is, listen, y'all don't understand how complicated all of this is. And from that standpoint, he's right. But what McGarity is quoted by Chip Towers as saying in a piece at DawgNation.com about this very subject, the notion of scheduling and rebalancing the schedule so you can maybe appease both Georgia and Auburn here with the return favor of getting 2 years in a row of Auburn and Athens to get it done. What McGarity says is that when Missouri and Texas A&M joined the conference, 3 schools had to move some traditional dates in order to make the schedules work. Auburn and Georgia were 2 of those schools. This is Athletic Director Greg McGarity. Chip Towers got the quotes of DawgNation. It was to make the 6-1-1 work. If we hadn't done that, a bunch of other schools, many more than 3, would have had to make all kinds of changes to undo it. Now, again, you need a much larger group of teams to make changes, many more than 3. So it's one of those things where it might not even have been the best for Georgia, but it was the best for the conference. And I think that's where some Georgia fans are saying, well, I don't care what's the best for the conference. I want what's best for Georgia here. And I guess ultimately that sort of takes us back to the bottom line. No matter what ends up happening with the scheduling deal here, and I don't know that it's necessarily all that consequential in terms of, Georgia not getting the return favor of 2 straight home games against Auburn, or even the way the schedule works out right now with an influx of good out-of-conference games. Really, no Georgia home slate should be all that bad. You got Notre Dame coming in 2019, for instance. But no matter where the future of this is going, I think what Georgia fans like is, if you compare the things that Kirby Smart says to the things that Greg McGarity says, the tone that Kirby Smart establishes. What's best for Georgia is what's best, no matter what would help the SEC here. Let's look out for number 1. Let's make sure our agenda and our objectives are being met, and then if there's any opportunity left over, then we'll see about doing the favor for the rest of the SEC. As opposed to what I think the perception was of Georgia, fair or not, by the way, but the perception was for a while in the years leading up to Kirby Smart coming to UGA, that maybe Georgia was looking out for the best interest of the SEC at the expense of its own best interest. That's no way to run a program, and I can promise you Georgia's rivals weren't doing the same thing in that regard. And no matter where the scheduling thing goes from here, it's nice to hear a head coach sticking up for his school. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We are presented by Marco's Pizza, and we are glad you're with us, no matter how you get to us today. A lot of ways for you to check out the program. You can do so on video, 10 a.m., the DawgNation Facebook, DawgNation YouTube page. We're available on the DawgNation Twitter feed as well. You can listen to us on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. We love being on the radio in the Classic City each and every day, and we are available in podcast form, wherever podcasts can be found, Apple Podcasts, Android devices. The world-famous DawgNation.com. Just glad to have you with us. As we said, Marco's Pizza is our sponsor. You can get Marco's Pizza into your game plan with dough made fresh and an original sauce recipe and 3 signature cheeses. Every Marco's Pizza is made primo, every store, every day, the Italian way. Order yours today from Marcos.com. I'll also give you a quick heads up on something. As I broadcast this show here live, we are on a Wednesday. 2 more days, obviously, this week. Next week, I am on vacation. So, DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, taking a bit of a hiatus for 1 week so I can enjoy some vacation with my family. And after that, we should be on a pretty strong schedule for most of the rest of the summer. So, I'm going to tell you about this a little bit over the next couple of days. So, when we don't show up for you on Monday, you won't be too caught off guard by what's going on there. Looking forward to a little vacation time next week, so we appreciate you being a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza each and every day, and do want to let you know that we do have a little bit of vacation time coming up. And by the way, for those of you that have your own vacations coming up here very soon, hope you get ready to enjoy that. I hope you've got a great summer plan with your family and your friends. All right, so we're going to get Mike Johnson here in a moment, and we're going to talk to him about a number of different subjects. But before we do that, one of the things I wanted to hit for the program, if you don't mind, to get sort of things back onto the football field here for a moment after doing a little bit of the off-field drama with the SEC spring meetings in Destin yesterday. ESPN does this series this time of year that I really love. You know, they have what starts off in January being the way too early top 25, and it gets updated again after signing day and updated again after guys declare for the NFL draft and updated again after spring practice. And then finally, the way too early top 25 just sort of morphs into their preseason top 25, and they re-release this thing kind of over and over again. And one of the things they do is they sort of find various talking points for each of the top 25 teams as they re-release. And it's just sort of a fun off-season conversation. I mean, I've said a million times, I like the off-season conversation in college football. I like facilitating that here on DawgNation Daily. I like to know what people within the bubble of DawgNation are talking about and what sort of outsiders are talking about as well. Georgia comes in at number 4 on ESPN's preseason top 25, and they were talking about breakout performers for each of these top 25 teams, and Alex Scarborough, the writer here, mentions as the potential breakout performer for Georgia, linebacker Monty Rice, which sort of got my eyebrows raised just a bit because while I think a lot of folks have high expectations for Rice, I don't know that necessarily Rice would be the number 1 name on a lot of lists from a lot of UGA fans of the most likely breakout star here for 2018, which is credit to ESPN for kind of, digging a little deeper here. What Scarborough writes is about Monty Rice, and this is from a few days ago, that all eyes were on inside linebacker all eyes were on inside linebacker this spring, with Roquan Smith having moved on to the NFL. It appears that a strong candidate to replace him has emerged. Monty Rice, a sophomore and former 4-star prospect, shined at G-Day by leading all players with 14 tackles. And that's kind of an interesting perspective to share, that maybe Monty Rice might be that kind of guy who could step in and play big, and even if he doesn't go on to be the kind of All-American level Butkus Award winner the way that Roquan Smith was, maybe he's the kind of guy that can at least keep that interior linebacking core for UGA to keep it solid. It would seem that Roquan Smith himself agrees with this. A few months ago we had Roquan Smith, the former great UGA linebacker and Butkus winner, right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, and I asked him, Roquan, when you look at the crop of linebackers left over at Georgia, they're all going to be vying to be the next Roquan Smith. Who from that group do you think could be the next Roquan Smith? And Monty Rice is one of the names that he mentions. Here's Roquan.
There's a lot of special guys back there right now. I'm looking for a lot of competition to be going on this upcoming spring because all those guys have some great skill sets from Nate Trez. He's one of the leaders of the linebacker room. Then you have guys like Tate Crowder, Monty Rice, then, Jaden McBride. So it's a lot of guys there, man.
Listen, ultimately what I think here is
So I'm definitely thinking it'll be a rotation or anything like that because all those guys have some special skill sets.
And listen, ultimately what I think you have here is, as Roquan Smith said, a collection, a committee of guys who are competing to get this done. That's ultimately what's likely to occur there, and Monty Rice is in that group, but it's sort of interesting that ESPN notices what he does during the spring and what he does on G-Day. I think something else that I think that Roquan Smith said that was also pretty interesting is the advice that he would give these guys, Monty Rice included, for how they go about the role of sort of filling in for him. Here is what he said when he was on DawgNation Daily not all that long ago.
Only thing I would say is just try your best in everything that you do. Don't take anything for granted, and, take advantage of every opportunity, because not the next one is never promised, and you never know what's in store for you. So just always make the best of everything. Don't take anything for lightly. Learn everything you can while you can.
I mean, ultimately, I think that ESPN's right for centering in on this inside linebacker position, and I think they're right to have some optimism in Monty Rice. It was watched closely during the spring. It's going to be watched even more closely during the summer. And for a Georgia defense that I still think has an expectation of being very good even without Roquan Smith, it's the play of the inside linebackers that will ultimately going to determine just how much of this happens and just how successful this group is going to be. It's great to have you with us here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. We got a lot of fun in store for the rest of the program, but for right now, let's get ready to check in with my partner from SEC Country Live and your good friend, a great friend of DawgNation. Let's welcome Mike Johnson right now. We're going to get Mike coming up here in just a couple of moments. Good to have you with us on the program. I will tell you this, that when we get into our Dog Day Q&A a little bit later on, you're going to get a chance to sort of weigh in from anything on today's show, but we also have sort of a unique topic for this time of year based on the stuff that's sort of been in the news as of late. Believe it or not, it kind of involves Tom Crean a bit. We'll get to that later on, and a lot of fun. Mike is ready to roll on now. We'll roll on with him, and it's good to have you with us as we welcome on Mike Johnson right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Mike Johnson gets the DawgNation Insider music today. I guess he's been upgraded here to a DawgNation Insider, and it's great to have him on the program as always. Of course, you know him and you love him from SEC Country Live. We check him out every afternoon, 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the SEC Country Facebook page and YouTube page and Twitter feed and all the other SEC Country video channels. Mike, welcome back to a DawgNation Daily today, presented by Marco's Pizza. How you doing?
I'm doing great, brother. It's good to be back on the show.
Well, it's good to have you with us. And, I got a lot of stuff I want to talk to you about, and some of this involves what I was just discussing before you came on. But let me squeeze in one thing here real quick before we sort of jump into the official protocol here. I was just talking about what ESPN said about Georgia linebacker Monty Rice, who was not really a, 4- and 5-star prospect coming out of high school. Some, recruiting service only had him as a 3-star guy, but it was sort of viewed as a big win when Georgia got him initially an LSU commit. You always thought to have a strong tie to Georgia. How much pressure is on a guy like that, or, a Natrez Patrick who's sort of in that same group of when you're saying, hey, you're part of the group that's got to fill in and replace a linebacker like Roquan Smith, who was clearly such a one-man gang a year ago. How much pressure on these guys when it comes to that?
I don't know if pressure is the word. I think that when you lose a guy like Roquan Smith, and we've touched on this before, when you lose a guy like Roquan, it's got to be everybody, right? I mean, you can't kind of put the onus on one player to kind of come in and be the next Roquan. And I think that if Georgia's defense is looking for Roquan to show up next year, I think they're going to be sadly disappointed. I think that all those guys, the biggest thing is just focused on getting better on a daily basis, right? I think you show up each day and you do the most you can, and you play as well as you can, and you try not to worry about the pressure, because the bottom line is this: Roquan was a once-in-a-generation linebacker. He was a Butkus Award winner, and now he's playing for the Chicago Bears. So for somebody to be able to come in and replace what he brought to the table, I think it's asking too much. I think that you really have to kind of look that entire defense in the mirror and say, hey, listen, we're going to need some more from the pass rushers. We're going to need some more from the secondary. We're going to need the rest of the linebacking core to kind of pick up some slack as well, and that allows everybody to kind of be a little bit more at ease and kind of maybe focus on their job a little bit more to help out in that regard.
I 1,000% agree with you, and now what I'll add to that is this, is obviously we're still very new and young into the Kirby Smart tenure. As a fan of the Georgia Bulldogs, and I've obviously got a Georgia G on my shirt today, so I'm a big fan of the Dogs here. But as a fan of the Dogs, I think what you hope happens over the course of the next few years, Mike, is that if you lose a player of the outsized significance of Roquan, that you can sort of point to, well, that might be the next Roquan in line. For instance, let's say that Channing Tindall was a year or two older. Well, he would obviously be thought of as maybe the next Roquan Smith, or maybe it's an Kobe Dean, or one of these 2019 linebackers that would be in the fold and sort of be able to kind of follow in those footsteps. I think what Georgia fans hope for is, okay, in year 3 of Kirby Smart, it may have to be committee to replace the loss of a superstar, but you hope 4 and 5 years down the line here, it's sort of transitioning from one superstar to the next. And I know that's to a degree pie in the sky thinking, but Mike, I mean, your alma mater has very much done the same kind of stuff where you simply just pass the baton to the very next guy. And if Georgia wants to one day beat Alabama, that's the kind of sort of talent threshold it has to cross itself. So I agree with your description of how things go for 2018. But if you want to say it's 2021 all of a sudden, then I think at that point in time, I think a lot of Georgia fans hope that it's transitioning from one superstar to the next.
Yeah, and B, I agree to that point. And what I'll tell you is this, from my experience, and you know, that's being a part of the Alabama roster and also watching it for the last few years since I have not been in Alabama, the superstardom kind of takes care of itself if each of those guys on the defense takes care of their job. You know, the saying always goes with Bill Belichick's kind of that do-your-job mentality, show up and do exactly what you're needed to do. So that defense can kind of go down the list and make those check marks. Hey, this guy did his job. Hey, this guy did his job. And from what I've seen, that kind of breeds the superstardom. You know, it's been said a couple of times this year. Boy, you know what? Not only does Alabama have to replace Rashaan Evans and Sean Deion Hamilton, but they're not going to have Mika Fitzpatrick behind him. Mika Fitzpatrick makes those guys' jobs easier. Raekwon Davis up front of those guys makes it easier. It's the same thing at Georgia. I mean, Lorenzo Carter and Davin Bellamy have made Roquan Smith's job easier, and Dominic Sanders and a lot of those guys in the back end did as well. So if those guys can all come together and all kind of play their role within the defense, then I think the superstardom begins to emerge in and of itself, and you'll start to learn some of those guys' names, and they become national household names in terms of college football.
Here's the one other thing I'll say on this point, and I hope I don't anger Georgia fans by saying this, but as great as Roquan Smith was in 2017, Georgia was in a position where had he gotten hurt, Georgia was going to have a very hard time matching that level of performance for the defense overall. I called him a one-man gang earlier. There were some moments when Smith kind of was that. It was almost like he had outsized importance in terms of his impact on the field. I think the best hope for Georgia is moving forward in the years ahead that no one player has that much control over the success of the defense. With no disrespect to Tyler Clark and Lorenzo Carter and Davin Bellamy and Trent Thompson and all the guys who also made strong contributions, Georgia had one player that was clearly the leader for the defense in 2017, and I think that you want more of a balance of productivity in the future here probably too.
I completely agree with you. And, you know, I hate to keep pointing back to Alabama, but you obviously know that's the school that I know.
Sure.
That happened last year. I mean, right? I mean, Sean Deion Hamilton tears his knee up against LSU. It's unfortunately the second year in a row that he's torn his knee up. And you had a freshman who had to come in who has all the athleticism in the world in Dylan Moses, but did not know the playbook yet. And I think that it's hard to just kind of plug and play. That's why I say it takes people around. It takes Mack Wilson next to a Dylan Moses, right? It takes the other linebackers in the core making sure they pick up the slack and making sure they allow those guys that are stepping into those shoes to play at a high speed and to the best of their ability.
All right, let's talk about something I talked about at the top of the show. And, this is a little bit deep in the weeds for some, but it's fascinating to me. Back in 2012 and 2013, as you're aware of, Mike, Georgia flip-flopped schedules with Auburn to accommodate Texas A&M and Missouri coming into the SEC and had to travel to Auburn 2 years in a row. And what we said on the show the other day was, because Malzahn's sort of complaining because he has to play now Georgia and Alabama on the road in the same year like he will in 2018. Well, the way to fix that, and by the way, it'd benefit Georgia too, is for Auburn to come to Georgia 2 years in a row, and all of a sudden this is all fixed and all taken care of. And Kirby Smart, it's kind of funny, he almost articulated the exact point we made here on DawgNation Daily when he spoke at the SEC spring meetings yesterday. And what I said a moment ago, Mike, is even if this doesn't happen, because ultimately I'm not even sure how big of a deal it really is, the fact that Kirby Smart says, hey, we want to look out for number one here. We want to take care of UGA, and we want a little payback from Auburn. Even if it doesn't end up leading to something, the fact that the Georgia coach is speaking that way about the Georgia program and not looking to sort of acquiesce to every need the SEC might have, I think a lot of Georgia fans like this new chapter of UGA history here.
I completely agree with you. And when I heard Kirby Smart's words, I kind of felt that way too. I said, listen, I love the fact that, and this is one thing that I'll be honest with you, BA, that makes me a little bit jealous of what's going on in Georgia. Kirby's a Georgia guy. And, you'll hear Alabama fans, well, he's bred in Alabama, all that. He's a Georgia guy. He's a Georgia alum. He has little things. Nick Saban doesn't have that. And I do, when I look at Kirby, when I see a Georgia alum, when I see a Georgia, a guy from Georgia that's leading the Georgia program, he's sticking his chest out for Georgia. He's not worried about anybody else. He's not worried about being an SEC commissioner. He's not worried about being a college football commissioner or talking about what's good for the game. He's going to talk about what's good for Georgia. He's going to talk about how Georgia gets an edge on people. How what it means for Georgia to play Georgia Tech, or what it means for Georgia to play Auburn, obviously, or Florida in a road game or a neutral site game. So I love that out of Kirby Smart. And you're right. I think that it as he goes, making statements like that only endear him even more to what the fan base is thinking and what they're really pulling for.
And I didn't really think about this until you said this, but it's such a great point that for a lot of coaches, something that happened in 2012 and 2013 when they didn't get hired until 2016 would be the previous administration. That's water under the bridge. That's something that happened before I got here. But for Kirby Smart, that's something that happened to my alma mater. I'm an alumnus of that school, and this is what happened to them. So he has sort of an emotional investment in that 2012-2013 story, even though he was working in Alabama at the time, and I think that's a really good thing. And I agree with your description of this on the other side as well. You know, to go deep in the weeds here for a moment, you know, Joe Oliva is the LSU athletic director, and virtually I think it's fair to say that he has very few friends among other LSU ADs for a lot of things. An example of this is how he handled that scheduling of the weather canceled game at Florida a couple seasons ago. He really fought for his own cause there, to the detriment of some of his relationships, certainly with Florida, who they still sort of view themselves as bitter enemies now. And you know, on that issue, I always sided with Oliva because I was always sort of proud of him for sort of fighting for what was best for LSU and let the rest of the SEC figure itself out. I mean, I think there was something to be said here. When you're competing for hundreds of millions of dollars, you know, doing somebody else a favor, unless you're going to get something in return, I'm not helping anybody.
Yeah, no, I think that's a way to look at it. You and I have obviously butted heads on this topic in the past. Well, I think Joe Oliva has hung Ed Orgeron out to dry, right? I mean, if I look at it and I'm saying, boy, you know, really, he's made things kind of an uphill climb in terms of LSU's schedule. You and I have covered on SEC Country Live that I think LSU's schedule is the toughest when it comes to SEC football this year. So it is an interesting debate. And I'm with you. I don't think Joe Oliva has a ton of friends, but I think Kirby Smart is well within his rights. And you're right. Kirby Smart's one of those guys that, listen, he was at Alabama when all this happened, but he is still a Georgia guy, and he's paying attention to that. And it's not just water under the bridge. It's, hey, this is my alma mater, and I'm going to make sure I stand up for what's right and what's best for the school.
Yeah, exactly. Let me go back to another topic that was, we talked about this on SEC Country Live yesterday, and this was something we dealt with here on DawgNation Daily earlier in the week as well. And that's Stetson Bennett, his decision to transfer. Georgia tried to keep him. Bennett wants to play. He's going to go JUCO for a year, and he'll pop up and be, I think, a very good starting quarterback, even though he doesn't have quite the size credentials that you expect a college quarterback to have. Bennett's gotten rave reviews as the scout team quarterback for UGA and would have been a good third-string quarterback for Georgia this season. Now they don't have him, and they'll try to figure out what they do to replace him. As a guy who played and blocked for quarterbacks, how big of a deal is it to have an unproven and really a guy that you may not even want to put into a game as a third-string quarterback? Obviously, Georgia got a very good starter, among the most dynamic backups in all of college football, in Justin Fields. And if both those guys stay healthy, you'd never even mention Stetson Bennett's name. But you're one injury away from moving somebody into a role of primary backup who you really don't know anything about and not really a scholarship-level player. I mean, how big of a deal is this? Is this the kind of thing we only talk about in late May, or does this have ramifications for Georgia during the season?
You know, it's tough to say. I think that there is a little bit of confidence that comes along with making sure you have a talented guy back there. I mean, when we went through the national championship season in 2009, we had Star Jackson as a backup, but behind him, we had A.J. McCarron. And A.J. McCarron was a third-string guy and an emergency player. If we would have needed him on a national title run, I think he would actually have been the starter in the end. So there was a little bit of confidence that came along with that, you know. When Greg McElroy needed reps off, we would put in A.J. McCarron to run 2-minute drills because he was a good player, and you kind of knew that he was the next man up there in Alabama. So, you know, I told you yesterday on SC Country Live, I don't think this is a problem until it's a problem. You know, until this becomes, a thing where all of a sudden one quarterback gets nicked up, and then all of a sudden you see Justin Fields starting, and you kind of look over that bench and say, boy, I hope Jake Fromm doesn't have to come in today. That's the kind of situation you're backing into. Yesterday I equated it to kind of having a backup kicker. Like, it's not a problem until that starting kicker gets hurt, and then you look around and say, boy, we're going to go for a lot of fourth downs here. So I don't think that this jumps up and grabs Georgia this year. I don't think that this backfires on Kirby Smart in any way. But, you know, Georgia fans know as well as anybody that quarterbacks do get hurt, and sometimes it's good to have a nice backup plan and maybe even a backup plan after that. And so it's going to be interesting to see it play out, and, I think a lot of people are going to be open for the best in terms of the health of that roster this year.
And quick follow-up on this, I mean, Nick Saban's clearly doing that. He's clearly sort of trying to provide an insurance policy for his team. They go out and get the kid from Arkansas State, so he's certainly thinking under these terms with the uncertain future of Jalen Hurts here.
Yeah, I definitely think he is, and I don't think that's something Nick Saban would ever admit, but I think it's a clear signal for him to go back and add a quarterback that was headed to a gray shirt at Arkansas State onto the 2018 recruiting class. I think it kind of tells you a little bit of the backstory here. And like I said, I don't think he would ever admit that, but I think this is Nick Saban just trying to do some roster management, understanding that, hey, listen, Mac Jones might be our backup in the fall if Jalen Hurts does decide to leave. And after that, you want to have somebody that's at least serviceable. And, that they have a couple of preferred walk-ons, but Nick Saban felt the need to go out and get another guy. So I think a lot of Alabama fans just look at that as an insurance policy.
All right, let me finish up with this. Saban kind of goes on a couple of rants yesterday at the SEC spring meetings. And, Mike, I don't mind telling you the truth here. I'm not saying this to troll you, but, if you're going to knock off Alabama from its perch as the reigning national champion and the team that's been the tops in the SEC here for a while, although Georgia's the reigning SEC champion for the moment, you got to do a little negative recruiting. You got to explain to kids why they don't want to go to Alabama. And I think the most fertile soil for negative recruiting against Alabama is, if you go there, Nick Saban's going to try to hold you hostage. It's true right now with Kennedy, the offensive lineman who might like to go to Auburn or Tennessee. It was true in 2016 with Maurice Smith. There are other examples, I think, here where Saban's going to do everything he can to restrict your ability to leave the program if it doesn't work out for you. Now, Saban, I think, is sensitive about this. He spoke out on it yesterday about the notion of grad transfers within the SEC. You obviously have a different perspective on this, given your background, but what do you make of all of this?
This has been tough for me, and I know that you and I are probably going to butt heads today on SC Country Live. This should make for an incredibly fun topic, but I think that the narrative that you just explained kind of goes along with what frustrates Nick Saban, because I don't agree with the rule. I think if you graduated school, listen, you should be able to go where you want to go. I think that Nick Saban looks at it from a couple of different directions. First of all, it's not his rule. It's an SEC rule. Maurice Smith got handed over to the SEC. He convinced the SEC, whoever was making the committee decision, he convinced them that he wanted to go to Georgia and further his education and do some different things. They were not on Alabama's schedule, and so, they looked at that as a thing that would be okay. I think that Nick Saban's saying, listen, we're either going to enforce this rule or we're not going to. He's tired of kind of being made the scapegoat as the face of this rule. I think another way of looking at it is Nick Saban comes out yesterday after the rant and says, listen, this is going to benefit Alabama in the long run. I mean, I used this example yesterday on a radio show. When you talk about, listen, what about a guy like Trey Smith at Tennessee? What if Jeremy Pruitt's not in position next year or the year after that? All of a sudden, Trey Smith, a guy who might be an All-American left tackle, looks at a place like Alabama after Jonah Williams leaves and says, well, you know what? I'd really like to go win a championship. I'd like to be a part of a championship roster. I think playing for Nick Saban will help out my NFL future. So I think that, and I think that Georgia would be held in the same regard by a lot of people on the East. I mean, imagine Georgia being able to go pillage the secondary down in Florida this year. I mean, look at Marco Wilson and C.J. Henderson and some of those guys if they, had the opportunity in a year or two to head up to Georgia and be a part of the secondary and the Kirby Smart. So I think it's a careful thing. I think Nick Saban's just tired of being made a scapegoat. But it's going to be interesting to see how the SEC comes out and makes some decisions, because I don't think that Nick Saban's in favor of this, but I don't think there's many other coaches that are in favor of it as well. I think that he's just mad that he's been made the face of the rule.
Mike, good stuff. We'll look forward to talking to you more on SEC Country Live later on this afternoon. You got Roll Tide Daily coming up today as well. That's going to be a lot of fun, and we'll check in with you again here very soon.
Yeah, Brandon, I got a special guest that I think you'll be excited to hear about today. His name's Corey Reamer. He played linebacker with me in Alabama. He also played at Hoover under Jeremy Pruitt. So the good old Jeremy Pruitt versus Kirby Smart discussion will come up again today, and I'll be make sure to make you aware of what was said in that discussion today.
Oh, that'll be a lot of fun, Mike. We appreciate that. We'll look forward to talking to you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Good stuff there from Mike Johnson. He's got Roll Tide Daily, 1 p.m. Eastern Time today. If you've got friends who are Alabama fans, I really would love for you to share that show with them. Hey, we like Mike. Now, we don't like Alabama, and we make no bones about that, but not everybody from the Yellowhammer State's terrible, and Mike Johnson's an example of a pretty good dude coming from Alabama, so let's let him build up his Roll Tide Daily following, much the same way we've done that here with DawgNation Daily. We're proud of him. He kind of gets that going here. Also, we'll see you at SEC Country Live, 3 p.m. Eastern Time today on the SEC Country Facebook, YouTube, Twitter channels, all those video feeds. We'll check in with you on that. Couple quick things here, by the way, in response to some of what Mike Johnson was just talking about there. Now, listen, this is one of those things where he's just going to see this transfer rule differently than I'm going to see it. If you're not quite aware, Nick Saban did talk a lot about this at the SEC spring meetings yesterday, and I think his purpose for talking about that are for a couple of reasons. There was that read optional report. Trey Wallace, I believe, the writer, we quoted from that a bit yesterday here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, that sort of brought the Maurice Smith recruitment and transfer from back in 2016 back to the forefront a bit. that's got something to do with this. But there's also a current graduate transfer that would like to leave Alabama, would like to play in the SEC. His last name is Kennedy. I believe his first name is Brandon. I apologize for not being 1,000% aware, but I believe it's Brandon Kennedy. I ought to know it's the same first name as me. That's why I'm doubting myself on this. But I think he's Brandon Kennedy, and he would like to go to Tennessee, maybe. Like to go to Auburn, maybe. That's ironically Alabama's two biggest rivals here, and Nick Saban doesn't want it. And what Mike says there is, and this is the line that comes from Tuscaloosa, if y'all want transfers within the SEC, then you better buckle yourself up for the Wild West, because Alabama would be the most in line to benefit from this rule. The truth is that's not the case. The teams that benefit the most from transfers are the teams that have gigantic holes in their roster, the way that Georgia did when Kirby first got here in 2016, the way that Tennessee does right now in the first year of Jeremy Pruitt, the way that Ed Orgeron at LSU does because of some of the misses that Orgeron's had on the recruiting trail. You look at all of the various transfers that LSU has taken, they've taken a bunch. Almost all of them can be pointed back to recruiting misses, which is fair. I think the transfer market's a pretty important market for building a good team. I don't fault teams for doing that, but it is just false, just flat out false to say if it's Wild West for transfers, Alabama's going to benefit the most. They don't have the roster spots to take on transfers, and the only way they would benefit from that is if Saban starts kicking more people off the team, which in itself is going to become a bit of an unseemly matter there. And Saban's deal, and we'll play the audio for you in SEC Country Live later on today, but Saban's deal of, this is not my thing, this is an SEC rule. But as we saw during the Maurice Smith deal, the SEC rule is only in place to protect the reputation, if you will, of the coaches, to allow them to a safe face here. And you can go back. We were actually, believe it or not, it seems like 1,000 years ago, but we were doing DawgNation Daily back during the Maurice Smith saga, and you better believe we talked about it every day. And ultimately, and DawgNation had great reporting on this. Ultimately, I believe that the reason why Maurice Smith was able to sort of shake himself free of the bondage from Alabama and get over to Georgia is because his mom went public. When Maurice Smith's mom went public and started telling her side of the story, public opinion changed in a heartbeat. And at that point in time, the SEC just could not keep Maurice Smith, bound to his Alabama, scenario there. They had to let him free. But if Smith's mom did not go public back before the 2016 season, I'm not sure it works out the way it did for Maurice Smith. And that was, by the way, to go back to what we started the show with, another example of Kirby Smart doing what was right for Georgia. Accepting a player, Maurice Smith, from his old employer, Alabama. He didn't work for Nick Saban anymore, and he proved that early on in his tenure by bringing him in, which is ironically, I think, what Jeremy Pruitt's trying to do with Brandon Kennedy. All right, let me quickly remind you that Kroger's got a lot of great stuff going on, including a chance to get involved with this winter chicken dinner when you don't have a lot of time but want a lot of flavor. How about some Kroger Deli chicken meals? That's really the way to go. $12.99 includes 8-piece fried or baked chicken meal, plus a side and rolls. You can visit your local Atlanta Kroger today. It's, of course, great to have Kroger a part of DawgNation. I've almost completely talked out my music here on the transfer story. So let me squeeze in a couple things here before we say goodbye to the SEC through. First of all, LSU gets a 2020 quarterback commitment. His name is TJ Finley. He's a 3-star prospect. He is from, how about this for a great Louisiana name, from Ponchatoula, Mississippi, Ponchatoula, Louisiana. And what I find to be interesting about this is an LSU team that desperately needs a big-time quarterback to emerge. Now, Joe Burrow right now has 2 years of eligibility. But just because you've got Burrow in place, assuming he turns out to be good, does not absolve LSU from its responsibility to go out and get a major league prospect for 2019. The fact that they are accepting a 3-star from 2020, does that mean that they don't quite have that pipeline in place to get the big recruit that they need? Because you can't get a transfer every single year. I think the future of Ed Orgeron is on shaky ground at LSU, and it's not because of the on-field situation. It's because of recruiting. By the way, Sports Illustrated has a great piece up right now. Ross Dellinger, who's actually just moved over to SI from having been at the Baton Rouge Advocate, kind of looking at the Joe Burrow decision to go to LSU. This is good stuff. We'll talk more about that on SEC Country Live later on today. Also, something else we'll probably get into a little bit more later on this week. I was going to talk about for our SEC through, but there's really probably better stuff to sort of dive in on this a little bit deeper. Jimbo Fisher was asked about James Coley's decision to stay at Georgia. Remember, Coley, gets a big raise and a promotion to Georgia. Part of the motivation for that is not just because of the fact that Coley's a good recruiter and was doing a great job at UGA, but because Jimbo Fisher had made some overtures to him to bring him to that staff at Texas A&M and really be a centerpiece for that staff as Jimbo Fisher tries to sort of rebuild the recruiting momentum in his new job that he'd somewhat sort of lost over the last couple of years at his old job at Florida State. I think one of the things you're going to see here is, in terms of rising stars in that Georgia coaching staff, obviously, Del McGee and Sam Pittman, guys like that, are as popular as they come. Young defensive minds like Dan Lanning and Glenn Schumann, you're going to hear a lot about them in the future. But the most coveted name of UGA assistants very well may be James Coley. And this season, as the Georgia quarterbacks play well, and I think they're going to both play well, I think that's only going to put more attention on Coley. I think that Coley becomes one of those really, really difficult quarterbacks for UGA to keep. We'll talk more about what Jimbo Fisher had to say about Coley on a later edition here of DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. And then finally, there's this one more quick story to get into from our somewhat expanded edition of the SEC Through. We showed you the video yesterday of Felipe Franks, the Florida quarterback. He's at one of these camps that you see this time of year, and once again, Franks doing what he's known for doing, throwing the ball seemingly a million yards. He wins the long throw competition again. He did a lot of that back in high school. Won the game against Tennessee a year ago with a similar throw like that, sort of a Hail Mary. It was kind of interesting yesterday on SEC Country Live to hear from Florida fans on this that say, you know what, I've seen him do this. Let me see him make a throw, sort of more of an intermediate type throw. Can he be a little bit more accurate on the shorter throws when he's not asked to throw the ball 75 yards down the field, which just sort of goes to show just how intense that Florida quarterback competition is going to be here coming up this summer, and determining just how much of a threat the Gators are able to be to a Georgia in the SEC East. That quarterback conversation is going to go a long way towards determining that. And now we'll make that your SEC Through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, before we get ready to wrap things up, do want to squeeze in a quick version of our Dog Day Q&A. And we'll obviously do more of this for the audience on video later on. If you want to weigh in, if you listen to the radio show, if you listen to the podcast, if you want to weigh in on this, you can reach out to me at DawgNation Daily. But I saw some interesting quotes from Tom Crean, the Georgia basketball coach, who is at the SEC spring meetings. He actually spoke to the media a bit yesterday, but he also made an appearance on the popular podcast known as Pardon My Take. It's the Barstool Sports Show, and Crean had a relationship with those guys predating his time being at Georgia, and they had him on a recent show, and he was talking about, the need to recruit, and one of the hosts was, saying something along the lines of, well, you obviously can't go after the same players that Kentucky's going after, and Crean sort of pushed back on that and saying, well, why can't we? Why can't we compete in the same recruiting waters that a school like Kentucky's recruiting? And this is a relevant question for Georgia basketball at the moment, given the fact that, recently Georgia just lost out on a 5-star recruit who was sort of mixed into the whole Mark Fox saga, and maybe he wanted to play for Fox, and when Fox left, maybe he lost interest in Georgia, but it's, a coincidence that as that was happening, he got the Kentucky offer, and the moment that Ashton Hagans, the 5-star point guard, got the Kentucky offer, he immediately sort of, leapt towards the Wildcats, essentially, describing that as a dream scenario. And I guess, the Dog Day Q&A for today, and we'll do some of this on video, and for those of you that want to weigh in, at DawgNation Daily on Twitter, we'll give you a chance to do that as well. Do you think it's possible that Tom Crean really can compete with Kentucky for recruits? He's talked about that here this summer. And it's kind of funny that, Crean has made more news during the summer than any Georgia basketball coach I can remember in quite some time. Sort of been around, some of the things that he's said with these speaking engagements alongside Kirby Smart have gotten some attention. Is this really an example of a fan base being energized by a brand new coach, or is this just more of the same from Georgia basketball? I'm kind of curious to find out what you have to say about that. We'll do some of that on video. You can also weigh in at DawgNation Daily on Twitter. And with that, we will get ready to wrap up today's edition of DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. And for those of you that are not aware, here on our show every single day, we take a lot of comments, and we try to save some time after our regular broadcast is over to sort of engage in real time on some of this kind of stuff. So if you've never checked us out on one of our video channels, we'd love to have you do that. And if you are a person that listens to the show, you like to listen while you're at work, the earbuds in, or you're driving around the road in Athens and you're checking us out on the radio, as I said, you can hit me up on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. That's always a good way to kind of get your voice heard, and I love the interaction we're able to have there. It's been really fun to talk to many of you here over the last few days. They're on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. I appreciate you reaching out to me, and it's fun to be able to talk back to you. And one of the things we no doubt talk about a lot on all forums of discussion is our mutual distaste for the Gators. Gatorator Countdown right here on DawgNation Daily. 150 days, an even number here. Dogs go back to Jacksonville, win again. We'll see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily. And speaking of comments on video, we'll look forward to diving into those a lot right now. Pretty much anything you want to weigh in on. I thought the Kirby stuff off the top of the show is pretty interesting. You know, sometimes not everybody likes the business talk, you know, the scheduling talk. You know, people like the on-field stuff sometimes better. But I thought all that was pretty interesting today. So if you want to weigh in on that, you can do that. Or really weigh in on anything. By the way, good to see Bobby Bryan throwing in the Gator hater on there. Appreciate that, Bobby. Trey Bratton also on Facebook. I should say Troy Batten, excuse me. Says that Crean's going to have to win 20-plus for at least 5 years. Great basketball recruits only go to the best schools on most occasions. I think that's probably true. And, you know, I think that there's obviously something in between competing with Kentucky for elite recruits and sort of getting better players than you've been getting. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like, you know, Kentucky essentially is in competition for the very best of the best. You know, how about you get better players than Auburn? How about you get better players than Tennessee? It seems like they've had more success recruiting, you know, top-flight players than what Georgia's had. And the great thing about basketball is it's not like football. You know, for these have-not programs in football, I mean, they got to bring in a gazillion players just to have any chance of competing, because you obviously play with 11 on each side. You got to have 2 and 3 deep to have a championship-type team. But you bring in 1 or 2. I'm talking about 1 or 2 good basketball players, and the entire fortune of the program is potentially changed. So it's a tough sell at Georgia in comparison to some of the other more heritage programs. But the good news is you don't have to sell that many guys to all of a sudden have the entire thing feel completely different. William Brown, back to football, says that South Carolina is going to be the true test in the East. Thought it was interesting that when BetOnline came out with its early looks at some of these at Georgia games, Georgia was listed as an 11-point favorite at South Carolina. So, you know, that gives you an idea of kind of how Georgia is viewed right now. Yes, maybe South Carolina is, to use the phrase, a true test, but it is a test that Georgia is still expected to pass with flying colors. Georgia was a 11-point favorite against South Carolina, about a 15-point favorite, I believe, against Florida. So this is one of those seasons in which, I mean, any loss is an upset. Even Auburn at home, even LSU on the road, any loss is an upset. You know, Georgia is going to be expected to win on the day the game is played. They're going to be expected to win every single game. And collectively, looking at the entire season, there is no game in particular where Georgia's thought to be, ooh, that's a tough one. Georgia's likely to lose that one. Georgia's going to be a sizable favorite in really all of these games this season. Doesn't mean going undefeated is a guarantee. You know, math is kind of a funny thing. Even when you have a 90% chance of, or even a 70 or 80% chance of winning each individual game, the sort of collective chance of winning them all obviously is, you know, less than 50%. So, I mean, still more likely than not that Georgia gets tripped up somewhere. But from Saturday to Saturday, you know, there is no game that you know Vegas is all that worried about for the Dogs right now. Austin Bell has an interesting line in here. He says, speaking of the Gators in Georgia, looked at some tickets for the game. UGA side 2 to 3 times more expensive for the same seats. Look like I'll be alone on the Florida side. Yeah, it was so funny to see the images last year. And listen, I mean, unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember when it was the reverse of this. But when you see the Georgia side just filled with fans and the Florida side completely, you know, empty there in Jacksonville, and you know, for those of us that took some drubbings down there in the First Coast, it was kind of nice to see that return favor, and it may be a little cheaper to get tickets on the Florida side here, not just this year, but for a couple of years going forward. Also on Facebook, Doug Rayburn bringing up the Diamond Dogs, 7:30 on Friday. I'd be curious to find out how many of you all are planning on making it over to Foley Field. You know, I have been to super regionals before. They are really fun. You know, a lot of the guys that work here will swear by the intense atmosphere that's going to be at a place like Foley Field here this weekend for the regional. Georgia plays Campbell. It's Duke and Troy, the other two teams involved in this UGA regional. If Georgia wins the regional, they'll be slated to host the super regional as well against likely Texas Tech. So, yeah, it's going to be a great run for Georgia postseason baseball. I'm going to be out of town for Saturday. If I could make it over there for Friday, I'd like to do that, but that may be a little bit difficult to pull off there. But, yeah, it's going to be a great atmosphere. Over on YouTube, Ty Middlebrook says, LSU is going to be a test for Georgia, but Auburn is the toughest game. Glad it's at home this year. Auburn is clearly the best team that Georgia plays. I think it's a debate of is the venue in Death Valley in October. We'll wait and find out the time for that. Does that make it tougher? And I think that's an interesting debate to have. Enrique Murillo, going back to the game in November against Auburn, says, we lost due to silly penalties, allowing Auburn to continue drives. Our offensive and defensive lines were dominated, and we could not stop the running game. Yeah, it was really weird. That was the one game this year where Georgia kind of got out-Georgia'd a bit. Now, you can say that Alabama probably did some of that too, but in terms of the regular season games, Georgia had been dictating the pace. Georgia had been pushing teams around. And unfortunately, that game in November, Auburn did some of that. I thought that Auburn was a good team in 2017, a team worthy of respect. And it was a great win when Georgia got the revenge against Auburn that was able to get. But they proved in November that they can be a tough opponent. They were tough on Georgia. They were tough on Alabama. And just the venue alone, playing the game in Jordan-Hare Stadium, that doesn't explain all of that necessarily. Brian Kephart says Soulja Boy making its return and revenge for the regular season game. Y'all think I'm kidding about this? I'm not. I want that to be the new tradition. If Georgia beats Auburn this year, I want them to crank that Superman. I want them to crank that thing and that's got to be like the new victory cigar for the Georgia-Auburn series. And for those of you that are not aware, going back to 2007 when the song was actually popular, that's back when they played it in Sanford Stadium a lot back then. But that game against Auburn, which was the blackout, they played it, and everybody in the stands were dancing. All the players were dancing. Vernon Lundquist and Gary Danielson started dancing to it on TV, and it sort of turned into this deal. And then Auburn in Jordan-Hare Stadium played it this year in the waning moments when Auburn was beating Georgia so bad. And I'm not even sure how many people, because if you're a young person, certainly if you're a student, you may never even heard of that song. You may not be aware of the Superman Soulja Boy. I'd play for you a little bit right now, but Facebook and YouTube will end up dinging us for playing unlicensed music. But a lot of young people in the stands would have had no idea what that even was. But it was obviously a retort back to Georgia for what happened in 2007. So if Georgia's winning the thing in 2018, you got to crank that thing up one more time. There's no doubt about that, and that's got to become the new thing that happens for the winning side there in that rivalry, which I think is great. Ivan asked a really good question. Does anyone know who Maurice Smith was pulling for in the national championship game? My hope is he was pulling for UGA. That's my guess. I would say that's probably what was going on there. Eric Edwards on YouTube says, I think the Dog's going to roll the Gamecocks. Death Valley is going to be the test, much like Auburn was last year, hopefully with a better outcome. Yeah, I don't think this version of LSU is as good, anywhere near as good as that version of Auburn, but the venue is tough. Death Valley is just a really, really tough stadium. And the one thing about LSU is they're going to be really good on defense. And if you're looking for recipe for upset, not just for Georgia, but for any team, no team in the SEC is as complete as what Georgia and Alabama are. Auburn is the next closest, but they are, I think, a somewhat distant third to Georgia and Alabama in terms of they can do it on both sides of the ball. Beyond that, though, you're looking for elite units. And the LSU defense, I do think, is going to be an elite unit. I think that Braden Fehoko, the transfer defensive lineman, is probably really good. I think that, what's his name? Is it Chason, Clavon Chason, is that the pass rusher? I think that he's going to be really good. Devin White is a terrific linebacker. Bringing in Alexander, the transfer from Stanford, is a big-time get. You probably expect a lot more from Grant Delpit, the safety. I have no idea what the status of Jacoby Stevens is. I'm not even sure what position he's playing anymore. But I think it's probably likely safety. So that's probably a pretty strong defensive secondary. The tough thing for Georgia against LSU that day is not stopping the LSU offense as much as dealing with the LSU defense. If Georgia can score some, it's probably going to win. But the LSU defense may be among the best units that Georgia plays all season long. You pick either side of the ball. You may say the Missouri offense is a little bit like this, but for Georgia, it's not about can a complete team match what we're doing. Is there a unit that could really cause the Dogs some trouble? And that LSU defense is among those units in the SEC that could be really top-notch. Ryan Wilbank says we'll beat South Carolina by 17 points. Let me scroll down here, get a few more Facebook comments. JY says, BA, now it's the floss. Yeah, I see these kids doing the floss all the time. I couldn't do that. I don't know how you move your shoulders that fast. But yeah, I see kids doing that a lot. I work with some like young kids at my church, and they can all do it so fast. Like they swing their arms that way and back. You'd be surprised. Some of these kids can do that thing like you wouldn't believe. Chris Branham says, my conspiracy theory is that once we got down against Auburn in that environment, we knew we didn't have it that night. Our play calling changed dramatically in the second half. We knew we had Auburn 2 weeks later and it opened it up in the SEC title game. You may be right about that, Chris. That may be true. I think something else that Auburn is just really good at is because they have those jet sweeps they can run in the Malzahn offense, it makes it tougher. Y'all know I'm not a former coach or former player, so take all this sort of analysis with a grain of salt. But because they're stretching you horizontally and because of Stidham's arm, and he did throw the one deep touchdown that day, they're also stretching you vertically. All of a sudden, they're just softening up the defense just a bit. And that day, the Auburn offensive line had a much better game than it had earlier in the season. You think about, Clemson sacked Auburn 11 times. Before Stidham really got going, maybe before Chip Lindsey really got his feet established and sort of maybe won the tug of war with Gus Malzahn. Maybe Auburn just wasn't quite as good at softening up those defenses. But one of the things that helped the Auburn offensive line, I believe, that day in November was the threat of the jet sweep, stretching you horizontally, the threat of Stidham's arm, stretching you vertically. So from that standpoint, Auburn can be a tough team. And, Kevin Steele has done a pretty good job building up that Auburn defense. It's really weird. I thought of Steele as a bad hire when it was made because he had been a bad defensive coordinator at a couple of different places, and yet he's found more success at Auburn than he has ever found anywhere else, I think, coming into this. And frankly, he's been a better defensive coordinator than Auburn had from a lot of other famous names. It's really weird how that kind of stuff sort of works out from time to time. So from that standpoint, I do have some respect for them as an opponent. When I think of Auburn, I've said this many times, y'all know I'm a pro wrestling nut, but Auburn is the intercontinental champion of the SEC. Georgia and Alabama are battling for the big belt, and Auburn's sort of the champion of the mid-card. And from that standpoint, Auburn, if you took Alabama and Georgia out of the discussion, Auburn would wax the rest of this league. They really would. They'd run roughshod over the rest of the league, but they are not as good as either Alabama or Georgia. Let me get a few more comments here. We got some time. Yeah, we're kind of up against it, but I'll squeeze in a few more. I like Brent Hickman's comment, who says, I understand we haven't seen it yet, but I think Georgia is as close to on par with Alabama as any team in the nation. I think despite our losses, we're going to be better this year. Brent, I think there's reason to believe what you're saying is true. I really do. And, in some respects, Georgia needs a little bit of either luck or, some guys to emerge quickly. It's not like it will be in 2019 and 2020 when you've sort of stockpiled even more of these guys. There's still a couple position groups for Georgia that I think could use an influx of talent, but for the most part, I think what you're saying is right on. Vaughn Jackson said, "BA, what did Maurice Smith's mom say?" So I talked about this a little early in the show. I don't remember exact words, and you can do a Google search and find this, but it was more than anything she was just telling her story publicly, right? Some parents don't know how to use the media. They don't know how, maybe they've never been quoted by a reporter before. They're shy. She was really good at using the media to tell her side of the story because, Saban knows how to tell his side of the story. It's not me. It's the SEC. Don't blame me. It's this big bad league that's making me do this. Saban's got his line, and he was sort of using that, and she had her line, and it becomes this battle in the court of public opinion. And when a mama steps up to bat to fight for her son, Nick Saban's not winning that battle. He's just not. Public opinion is going to be what it is, and no matter what the SEC rule says, Maurice Smith's coming to Georgia at that point in time. She was smart enough to do that, and not every parent's going to be quite as media savvy as she turned out to be. I don't remember the exact quotes. I just remember her being, in my opinion, instrumental in getting changed what got changed. All right, I've really got to go. Let me try to get a couple more in here real quick. Nick Lurch, thanks for the kind words. Yeah, and he talked about, taking family time and enjoy it. They grow up before you know it. And my wife and I both feel the same way. I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. And, they were just babies like a minute ago. And many of you would say, well, my kids who are grown now were just 6 and 3 not all that long ago. And, my wife and I both feel the same way that, we get pulled in a million different directions, and I love, what I get to do here, but this is important time for us, and we go as just our family. We don't go with friends, other family, because we want to share this this time together. So Nick, I appreciate you saying that. That is the one thing we are not going to compromise on. Greg Prolago says he got some St. Simon's vacation coming up. Yeah, St. Simon's a great place. Mark Schreiber says, are we planning anything special for SEC Media Day since it's in Atlanta this year? That's a great question, Mark. We are likely to be doing something big for that. We've talked a little bit about it. We need to be talking more because that's another thing. July is going to be here before you know it. All right, let me hop back on YouTube, then I got to get out of here. Brian Kephart says, PCB bound BA. No, I'm not a Gulf Coast guy. A lot of y'all are over there on the Gulf side, 30A and Panama City and everything else, and you like all that. I'm an Atlantic Coast guy, and I guess I kind of always will be. Philip Hudson also says, what's the status of Zamir White? Listen, Zamir, everything I've heard is a lot of optimism. It sounds like, there's some whispers coming out of this thing that he's in pretty good shape, and he's much like Nick Chubb, working towards sort of a lightning pace of recovery here, and I think Georgia fans can expect some good things from him. All right, we have got to go. I've got a lot of folks who are waiting on me to stop talking here, so let me do that on their behalf. Thank you so much for watching the show. For those of you that listen to the podcast, I really appreciate that. This conversation is very, very important to me, and it's something that I'm really glad I get a chance to do every day. I'm thankful for Marco's Pizza for making it possible, but I'm thankful most of all for each of you, because if y'all weren't here, I'd have nobody to speak to every day. Sorry about that, Eddie. If y'all weren't here, I'd have nobody to speak to. So I really, really appreciate what you guys do. And I'm going to miss you next week, but we got 2 more days this week to really do some good stuff. I'll also see you at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for SEC Country Live, and we'll have the podcast up, and tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Tomorrow's going to be a fun show. I've got some stuff planned. I can't tell you all about it yet, but it's going to be, I think, pretty interesting. We'll do that tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's DawgNation Daily Live presented by Marco's Pizza. We'll see you then. Y'all have a great day.